Let's explore how a payment is routed through the Lightning Network. And to do this, we need to introduce the concept of a HTLC. So what does HTLC stand for? It stands for Hash Time Locked Contract. Now, the time lock part of this should be self-explanatory. In Bitcoin, you can lock funds up such that they can't be spent until a certain point in time in future. But what is a hash lock? What's a hash? Why do we need to lock funds behind a hash in this case? So a hash function is a one-way function where you can give the function an input of any size and it will spit out a random looking output of a fixed size. So you can give the function an input of 1 and it spits out an output of a certain size. You can give it an input of 36 and it spits out an output of a certain size. In the extreme case, you can give it an input of an entire book or encyclopedia and it will still spit out a random looking output of a fixed size. Some examples of hash functions are SHA-256, SHA-3, RIPE-MD, and hash functions are used all over Bitcoin. They're a really useful cryptographic primitive. A key aspect is that it's one way. So if you are given the output of this function, the hash, you cannot calculate what preimage generated that hash. You cannot invert the hash function. The only person who knows what preimage was fed into that hash function to generate that hash is the individual who generated that input. Okay. Just being given the hash gives no clues to what the input to that function was, what the preimage to that hash function was. So if we go through the payment flow, it should become clearer why we need to lock funds up to a hash. So in this case, Charlie is the vendor and Alice is buying a good or service from Charlie. Charlie says to Alice, "Hey Alice, here's an invoice," and as part of the invoice, Charlie will give her a hash of a random input. But Charlie doesn't tell Alice what the random input was that generated that hash. Charlie merely says, "Send me the payment and I'll send you the good you purchased." And Alice, when Alice learns what the preimage was to the hash that Charlie has given her, then Alice knows that the payment has been completed. So Alice's Lightning node effectively says to Charlie's Lightning node, "Thanks for the invoice, Charlie. I'll try to find a route to get that payment to you as we don't have a channel open." In the worst case, Alice could open a channel directly to Charlie, but if every time you made a payment you had to open a channel directly to the person you're sending money to, then most of the time it would make more sense just to make an on-chain transaction. Right? The real power of the Lightning Network is that you can get payments to a destination that you don't have a payment channel open to, and you are using other people's payment channels to get a payment to that final destination. So Alice says to Charlie, I'll try to find a route to get that payment to you as we don't have a channel open. Thankfully, in this case, Alice's Lightning node sees that there's a relatively easy route to get her payment to Charlie. She only needs to go through Bob. So Alice's Lightning node communicates to Bob and says, "Hey Bob, I see you have a channel open to Charlie. Can you get this payment to Charlie?" Bob's Lightning node responds and says, "Sure, Alice, I'll send you the preimage to that hash that Charlie gave you as part of the invoice once Charlie has confirmed he has received the payment." Bob communicates to Charlie and says, "Hey Charlie, here's a payment from Alice. Provide the hash preimage and we can update our channel balances." So the flow of this payment is that the Lightning channel between Alice and Bob, there are going to be balances moved from Alice's side of the channel to Bob's, and in Bob and Charlie's channel there's going to be balance moved from Bob's side of the channel to Charlie's. So from Bob's perspective, this nets out as no difference because his balance has increased in the channel with Alice and it's decreased in the channel to Charlie. But Alice's balance in the channel with Bob is going to go down, and Charlie's balance in the channel with Bob is going to go up. So Alice has effectively reduced her balance and Charlie has increased his balance, and so it nets out as a payment from Alice to Charlie. Charlie's lightning node says, thanks for the payment, Bob. Here's the pre-image to the hash that I gave Alice as part of the invoice. Let's update our channel balances. Bob says, thanks for the pre-image, Charlie. Our channel balances have now been updated. And all that's left is for Bob to communicate to Alice, give her the pre-image to that hash, and update the channel balances in Alice and Bob's Lightning channel. Alice responds, thanks for that pre-image, Bob. Our channel balances have now been updated. I consider my payment to Charlie completed. So this pre-image is revealed backwards from the destination to the source. And when the source receives the pre-image, the source knows that the payment has been completed across the route, right? And so this is why we need a hash lock, because this ensures that the source learns that the payment has been completed, because all of the nodes in the route have communicated this pre-image back from the destination to the source. So what can go wrong? Well, Bob could have agreed to get that payment to Charlie, but then become unresponsive and never told Alice what the pre-image was to the hash, and Alice would be in a scenario where she wouldn't know whether the payment had been completed or not. So Alice is effectively saying, Bob, what was the hash pre-image? Has the payment been completed or not? I don't know, you're not responding. Alice can assume eventually that the payment hasn't been completed, and that channel balances in that channel between Alice and Bob shouldn't be updated because the payment wasn't completed. Bob never gave Alice the pre-image to that hash, and so Alice can refuse to update the channel balances and try to find an alternative route. Now, if Alice gets concerned that Bob's been unresponsive or offline for a very long period of time, Alice might be in a situation where she's thinking, well, I have this Bitcoin locked up in the channel with Bob, but he's just been offline for days or weeks, he's just not responsive. Why should I have valuable Bitcoin locked up in this channel to Bob if it's not proving useful to me? It's not allowing me to get payments to Charlie or any other vendors. I should probably use that capital and allocate it to a channel with a different channel counterparty. So Alice can say, I want to cooperative close this channel, Bob. I don't like the fact that you're unresponsive or offline for long periods of time, and it's not helping me get payments to the vendors that I want to pay. Now, in this case, Bob could continue to be offline and unresponsive. So Alice is in the position where she's saying, well, you aren't even responding to my request to cooperatively close the channel. But Alice has this alternative path to close the channel unilaterally. So she doesn't need Bob's input to close the channel. It's a more complex, unhappy path to go through the unilateral close route, but it's still perfectly possible. Now, maybe Bob eventually comes along and says, Alice, I'm sorry, Hurricane knocked my node offline. I see you unilaterally close the channel with the latest balances, all the best. And they go about their business without having a channel together, but no one's lost any money, there's no problem. But maybe Alice, being a mischievous person, identified an opportunity to try to steal Bob's balance in the channel. Because she'd known that Bob had been offline for a long period of time, Alice thought, well, maybe I can try and close the channel with balances from a previous revoked state, like a historic state where Alice's balance was higher than it was at the latest state of the channel. And so Alice tries to close the channel with previous revoked balances and thinks she'll get away with it because Bob's offline and doesn't know what's happening. But maybe Bob's come online and is effectively in this position where he's saying, Alice, why did you close the channel with expired revoked balances? You thought you could get away with it because I was offline. And this is where Bob can broadcast the justice transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain, effectively stealing Alice's funds, punishing her for trying to close the channel with revoked historic balances. And as long as Bob identifies that Alice is trying to cheat him, Bob can broadcast this justice transaction and ensure that Alice doesn't steal his money. In fact, Bob actually steals Alice's money as in a justice scenario. So that's how the payment flow goes. That's some of the unhappy paths. I'll end just by exploring what the downsides are for Lightning payments versus on-chain payments. And as I alluded to in the justice transaction scenario where Bob needs to watch the blockchain in case Alice tries to broadcast and get confirmed a revoked state, there is this online requirement to receive Lightning payments. If you aren't online, you can't receive Lightning payments. This communication between Lightning nodes needs to happen. So all those speech bubbles need to happen, and they can only happen if Lightning nodes are online. There's also this requirement to watch the blockchain. You can outsource that to a different party or multiple different parties. That would be a watchtower scenario. Another downside is that some routes and ultimately some payments could fail. If there's no route to a destination or the amount of the payment is so large that there's just no channels that can route such a large payment, then the payment could ultimately fail. You also need to understand the topology of the network, right? So Alice's Lightning node had to work out that she could route payments to Charlie through Bob, right? That was Alice's responsibility to work out if there was a route to get her payment to Charlie. And so to try to work out whether there is a route to a destination or to assess which of multiple possible routes you want to use, the Lightning node needs to have an understanding of how the whole network is set up and what Lightning nodes have what channel capacities, etc. So in comparison to an on-chain payment, you don't need to understand the topology of the whole network of Bitcoin full nodes, right? You just have a few peers, and as long as they give you accurate information and aren't trying to attack you, you don't really care what's happening on 99% of the network. But that's different in a Lightning setting. In a Lightning setting, you do need to have an understanding of the whole network, because otherwise you won't be able to work out a route to get your payment to your destination. The amount you receive is constrained by the capacity in the channel and the balances in the channel. That's a downside to on-chain payments. On-chain payment, you're only restricted by the amount of Bitcoin you own, and you can send whatever percentages of the Bitcoin you own to somebody else. You don't need to worry about ensuring that there's channels with sufficient capacity in them to get your payment to that destination. And the final thing is backups are much harder because there's this interactivity and states or balances and channels are changing all the time. You need to back up the latest state of the channel, and if you don't back up and you're knocked offline for a long period and you come back up, often you'll be requesting help from your channel counterparty to try to get that latest state. And so then you're in a bit of a vulnerable situation, because if your counterparty wants to try to cheat you and you're unsure what the latest state of the channel is, then you can get in troubles that way. So quite a few downsides or challenges, but it's ensuring that there is a no or minimal on-chain footprint. And so being able to make large numbers of payments without hitting the blockchain saves you a ton of fees, and also is great from a scalability perspective because you're not taking up a valuable resource, essentially block space.